You're watching The Lookout, production of the Division of World Languages and Cultural Studies here at Minot State University. I'm your host, Samuel Stinson. We're joined today by Amanda Watts. Amanda Watts is an assistant professor, humanities faculty at MSU, who teaches in both the English and art departments. Amanda Watts is an archaeologist and object conservator who combines public archaeology with expertise in material science to investigate the stories that objects can unlock from the past. Amanda Watts has over 20 years of field experience on sites in Egypt, Turkey, Afghanistan, Rapa Nui, the United Kingdom, and the United States. With interdisciplinary work in archaeology and rhetoric, her research interests have centered on new approaches to sharing the excitement of archaeological investigation with broad and diverse publics. Amanda Watts, thank you so much for being on the program today.
Thank you for having me. It's been great getting to know you, and I'm excited to talk about some archaeology today.
Yeah, we've had some interesting conversations lately. I just most recently spoke with your English 191 class, and I think that was a real treat being able to meet the students, and I appreciate that opportunity. So I'm really looking forward to this. So my first question for you is, what got you interested in archaeology, and what keeps you motivated in the subject?
I think it's stuff. Since I was a kid, it was not necessarily the Indiana Jones movies that were, of course, part of my childhood because that's the era I grew up in. But honestly, archaeological objects. I was born in Chicago, and from a young age, the Field Museum was the place we would go. And my mom was always kind of concerned about, like, oh, she's 4, mummies. Is that a thing? And me being so fascinated with just the objects and the trappings from the exhibitions and sitting there reading every little display nugget of text I could find. It was really the stuff that spoke so much to me more than, I don't know, the history books, the textbooks. I was an okay history student, but an excellent material science and archaeology student.
Did you spend a lot of time being in Chicago? Did you spend a lot of time at the Art Institute?
Not as much. And I think, it was so long ago because I am a Nodak. I am from North Dakota. We moved here by the time I was kind of early mid elementary school. So this is definitely what I call home. But State Heritage Museum, I am proud to say that my son has been if we head to Bismarck for any reason, can we go to the Heritage Museum? It's like, okay, buddy, we've only got 20 minutes. You can look at the dinosaurs for 20 minutes. So yes, it's going to be an archaeologist who raises a paleontologist, maybe. We'll see.
So another question I have, I'm going to state that one of the qualities of your research that I find very interesting is the interdisciplinary character of it. So you've got archaeology and rhetoric, 2 fields with some pronounced differences, and you've got a specialty and focus on English composition and art, humanities. So what is your general approach in how you combine all of your various interests in your work?
I think the central through thread is stories. The objects tell stories, people tell stories. I mean, that is what we focus on in literature. It's what we like to focus on in the humanities. And to me, the objects kind of tell a truth that we often have to sift through a little harder in the written text. I think one of my catchphrases is people lie, garbage doesn't. So in an excavation, honestly, my favorite place to get stuck, because I volunteer for it often, is the midden pile, the trash heap, because people like to talk about how they either perceive how they live their lives or how they wish they lived their lives, or the sort of most perfect aspects of how they live and what they think and what they do. And I think that is what gets reflected in literature. We can look at sort of the aspirations of a society or culture. But when I dig through their trash, I see what they were actually using and eating and valuing. And it tells sometimes not just a different story, but really enriches the story that we know from text, to be able to see that, the foods that they ate, whether they be rich or quite poor, the games that they played, the tools that they used and wore out. We can see what they actually did in their lives.
So where does broken pottery come from? That seems to be one of those things that shows up time and time again in this conversation.
Broken pots, yes, the staple of archaeology. Issues going on there. One of them is preservation. People may use 100 different things, but how those different materials deteriorate in soil or in their environment, we just don't have a lot of the organic material unless it's a very exceptional kind of burial site. Whereas ceramic is baked dirt. It's basically rocks. It's not going anywhere. So we've always got that ceramic material, and it's going to survive in almost any environment. So you can count on your ceramics being there. And the other thing is with ceramics, people don't use broken pots, or at least they very rarely use broken pots. So when something breaks, like a ceramic vessel, you can't just kind of repair that like a metal object. There isn't a whole lot of reuse for it. So those tend to get discarded where they broke. And that can tell us a lot about where people were living, what they were up to, what kinds of things they were using when they broke. Um, and so the ceramics are always there. And those are one of those things that when it busts, they dump it. So we get to find it where that happened.
So I also, this is a follow-up to what you were saying. I'm interested in this little anecdote. Sometimes I hear people will say, well, in order to get down to the city that was there 1,000 years ago, or 2,000 years ago, or 3,000 years ago, it's actually built under the current city. You have to dig deep in order to get there. Why is that? What is it about the way that the dust is settling that causes that, or what does cause that?
The law of superposition. The way humans live, we live in a depositing culture. We live in a depositing fashion. It's totally interesting, even on, say, a farm that's been used for several generations. The farmyard will start to build up because you start depositing things, and you'll find that the barn door actually gets shaved off on the bottom because it stops opening things. So we'll actually build up. We always build up. And demolition, you often don't completely demolish the old before you start building on the new. And a little bit of reuse happens, but we always tend to kind of flatten out and then build again, and flatten or level it out and build again. So there's entire artificial mountains, hills built in areas where people have just been living there that long. So we live up unless some extenuating circumstance may cause us to dig back down at any point. But in general, the longer we're there, the sort of higher the floor level gets in any area.
Now, I saw one of your publications on wineskins. Could you tell us about the provenance for that publication, how it came about, and what it's about?
It all started at a party. Um, so, in my archaeology degree in undergrad, I went to a university that had a very good hospitality administration school. So, they had chefs and things, and I actually did a 2-year degree in wine. So I ended up with a wine degree as well as an archaeology degree at Boston so that I could consider myself, I don't know, well educated for parties. And while I was at the Institute of Archaeology, we had an organics conservator come to a party. And she was kind of she is still one of my superfan heroes in the conservation world. She's a big time basketball star, but of organic archaeological material. And we got to talking about how the way you use certain objects gets shown in the objects. And it's very obvious with something like a knife, you get those sort of wear marks and it can even deposit materials. But what about skins? Wine skins, like the winemaking process, as we know with beer making process, it creates gases as you make alcohol. And there's even just sayings in the Bible about, you don't put new wine in old skins. And it's like, well, do you think the elastins in that skin, like it gets stretched out the first time it makes wine and then it just can't stretch again? Why do you think that is? Do you think there's a way we could tell? Did you make wine in a wineskin? Or was it just a transport skin? Like, does it actually stretch the skin when it fills up with gas? So we started to kind of investigate, how does the wine affect the skin? And then from a wine connoisseur sort of perspective, how does the skin affect the wine? We certainly can tell what kind of wood a barrel is made of just by tasting the wine, whether or not a Chardonnay has been oaked in an oak barrel for a time. So what if it's been skinned? Can we taste that leatherness to it instead of the wood? So we did some experiments and did some microscopic analysis of skins that we had in collections from wine, and we're able to see kind of that stretch. We looked for tannins, but of course, the tanning process of leather introduces tannins, and so would wine. So I think that would be a lot bigger, more sophisticated investigation that still needs to be done. So that is further research potential for somebody. And also a bit for fun, we bought some new wine skins from Spain and we rested wine in them for a month, 3 months, and then tasted them to see how much you could tell that there had been a skin added to that flavor profile. And quite a bit is the answer. There was a distinct skin to having had that wine rest in that leather. So it was fun. It was really exciting. And it's still one of my most popular publications because it's a bit off the bead.
Now, Amanda has brought some photographs from her archaeological work and has graciously agreed to curate these experiences. So we're going to start with the first of these. So Amanda, could you tell us what the first of these pictures is? What's going on here and where is this?
Yes. Welcome to Logar province on the Afghan-Pakistani border. We are in the laboratory on site at the Mezainek excavations. Mezainek is a Buddhist monastery complex from 4th, 5th century AD, and it is an incredible anomaly in our sort of historical understanding of the Silk Trade route, of the spread of Buddhism, of economics during this period. There is, okay, so Mezainek, you're getting a little bit of a Afghani language lesson here today, is little copper mine or little copper source. And it is perhaps not so little at all, maybe up in the top 5 copper sources on planet Earth that we know of. So people now want to mine that. There was a Chinese-Afghani agreement about mining that resource for a period of time, and that's what sort of sparked the archaeological excavations to kind of do some cultural resource management before this area got strip mined. And it turns out that people have been mining and exploiting that copper resource for thousands of years. We had a mine and then a coin mint where they were minting coins in ancient times. And then a Buddhist monastery built up around that and was still very active. And so the monasteries tend to be up on the tops of the hills. And there are 7 of them that we have found. We are at the furthest north one here in a little tin box. And so you had these Buddhists working their practice, and it becomes this religious hub. And then down in the valley, there's a bank and a mint, and we would imagine tons of Silk Road trading traffic through this area as well. So we are dealing with kind of a huge cultural fusion space in ancient times, in the ancient world. And so here I am reconstructing some ceramic pieces. But man, we have art and small sculpture and trade goods from Greece and the classical periods. We've got stuff that's from the Indian subcontinent. So this is really a place where art and cultures are meeting along this road.
And what are those? Are those white markings on that material on the table?
Oh, that's tape.
Oh,
I am reconstructing them, and that is me using masking tape in a very surgical stitch kind of way, keeping the pressure even so that the different fragments actually settle in the angle that they were originally in the bowl. It's a bit like surgery. Um, this one, we are at the National Museum of Afghanistan in Kabul. Completely separate project. We've just flash forwarded a few years. The National Museum in Afghanistan was sacked when the Taliban took over a few decades ago. And something really sort of horrible but fascinating happened. The Hada sculptures were a Buddhist altar piece set from Hada, which is out in sort of the northwestern half of the country. And all of these different small statues, anywhere from sort of like Barbie size to quite grand life size statues, were decorating these altars. And they, again, show artistic influences from all over the ancient world, East and West. And they were quite prized in the collection at the National Museum. But of course, they represent a Buddhist, non traditional religious practice, and the Taliban were, I guess, iconoclasm is the only thing I can think of. But normally, in traditional violence against religious material, iconoclasm, you tend to want to destroy the symbols as symbols. Whereas with the Hada material that we have here, I've got a bunch of little faces that I'm cleaning off of these sculptures. And we found that there was actually violence to the human figures as if you were doing violence to a person. So like eyes were gouged out, throats were cut, heads were sort of bashed in with the way that you would have like an interpersonal violence moment. So these objects tell us not just the story of ancient Hada, but they tell us a story about the event from 25 years ago and really the thoughts and the passions that went into that violence were very interesting and unusual. So this has been wonderful work that we were able to do up until a few years ago on kind of reading and trying to reconstruct the Hada material.
so for my own interest, is this a different event than I think it was the large statues that were destroyed that by dynamite?
Yes, the Bamyan Buddhas. It was that exact same year was sort of when all of that non-Islamic material was being erased from the cultural history. The Petrie Museum. This is at the Sir Flinders Petrie Museum of Egyptian Archaeology in London, England. This is a fascinating collection because it is teaching material, and it is what Flinders Petrie brought back in the 1880s through the sort of 1920s or 30s from Egypt and Palestine. And it kind of represents the very first formal archaeological excavations. Archaeology has been a thing that's been happening for thousands of years of people getting interested in the stuff that was left behind by past cultures. In fact, Ramses II was quite the archaeologist himself, excavating and recording architecture and material from Egypt that was thousands of years old to him, right? Cleopatra was closer in time to us than she was to the building of the pyramids. So that sort of long history there. We already had ancient Egyptians doing archaeology on ancient Egypt. But the actual field or professional career of archaeology was sort of born with Flinders Petrie in the 1880s when he brought scientific methodological practices to excavation. I mean, we wince now at some of his practices, but he was certainly a pioneer towards the right direction. And I did a condition assessment and overall assessment of the human remains in that collection because we started to have some of those kind of interesting ethical conversations about visible storage. which has started to become quite popular with museums, that you've got your display, and then the storage is usually quite closed or restricted to the public because it's simply not on display. It's not interpreted. There's nothing secretive about it. It's just not on display. So visible storage started to be a trend where you can take a lot of your storage materials and arrange them in either glass fronted storage, putting them out on shelves on front so that your storage area can also be visually accessible to objects. And sounded great, okay. And then we started looking through, and the human remains in that starts to be, should you really have shelves where all of a sudden there's a bunch of severed human heads and you weren't expecting that and they're not interpreted? So a lot of those sort of ethical issues about display, we kind of had to be like, all right, how many objects are we dealing with and what kinds? And this was a chance to really get into the mind of Sir Flinders Petrie. I got to know his handwriting because he hand wrote some object labels and things and hand wrote some notes on objects. So I was able to see when he had handled pieces. He had gotten rid of kind of one of his more famous updates to archaeological practice is he got rid of foremans, and the head of archaeology actually was the foreman. So he was very much more hands-on than any archaeologist before him. So his handwritten labels on hundreds of objects makes sense. But I also know that he was making the decisions about what we were bringing back to London, what we were bringing back for the collection. And the human remains, absolute total age of reason clinical mind of his, if there was some interesting aspect, he just took that part. So if we've got, interesting painted nails, we would just take the hand. We wouldn't take the whole body. If there was an interesting hairdo, braids or something, he would just take the head, not the whole body. So he was quite, I don't know, a removing of that sort of emotional, holistic idea of a human body. But that I think was very much part of a lot of his logical reasoning and thought. So I really kind of got to see what he was thinking while he was collecting things as I went through and inventoried this collection. An interesting fellow, not a real emotional guy as far as I can tell. Rapa Nui, also known as Easter Island. Rapa Nui is one of the most remote inhabitable islands in the Pacific. It falls outside of the tropics just by a hair. So while it's beautiful all year round, they do have seasons. We did a lot of survey on the island in the months that I was living there. And it is a rocky, craggy island. So getting survey done on vast swaths would sometimes be done by horseback for efficiency, because when you're looking for big moai statues, they're hard to miss, even if you're moving at a faster pace than you can walk and a little higher off the ground. So that is me and my trusty steed as we were surveying, looking for fallen moai. And the work there, I think, we really kind of rewrote a lot of the preconceptions about what the purpose of the moai really were, because big tsunami waves had knocked down every single statue on the island at some point between prehistory and the historic rediscovery period. The kind of guessing at how they were replaced back up on their plinths was inaccurate. They are not facing out in a lot of situations. We actually found that the way that they were meant to be sitting was facing inwards towards the island. The eyes were not actually carved out and placed at the quarry. The rest of the features were, they were completely finished statues, and then they would get walked down the mountain, a bit like you would move a refrigerator, just kind of like placing on one side and moving that heft. They would walk them down the mountain and sort of ceremonially walk them up these kind of triangular platforms. And then once they were in place, they would carve the eyes in and then place the white shell material and then a red top hat made of scoria stone. So the ones that don't have eyes carved in, we know that they never actually made it to a platform. So those were removed from being stood upright. And yeah, so the way that we were able to get into the head of at least what that ritual practice looked like helped us kind of inform how those moai should be placed as we kind of tried to put them back the way they were before the most recent wave. So this is at Çatalhöyük, one of the oldest urban civilizations in human history. It's out on the plains in modern day Turkey. An ancient, super urban complex. It's amazing how people went from sort of small family groups and then this leap of faith with division of labor. You can imagine if I agree that you'll grow my crops and I will make you pottery and you're going to guarantee to feed me and I'm guaranteed to make sure that you have the tools and equipment you need to feed me. That seems like it would be a fairly slow process, but as far as we can tell in archaeology, once it happened, it just sort of exploded into this huge interdependency of a large group of people, because these buildings at Çatalhöyük are built packed in. It's like a super urban apartment complex kind of situation, thousands of years old out on the Anatolian plains. And they're highly decorated. You're starting to live in these very small spaces, all of your personal belongings in there. So what we've got here is I'm injecting a adhesive consolidant into the plaster that is still on the walls inside one of these rooms. And it's painted. I think you can kind of vaguely see some of the red and black pigment there. But we've got painted wall murals in what look like everyday people's houses. So that's just me trying to keep them in place so that we can study them exactly how we found them for as long as we possibly can. Chedworth. Here we are at a Roman villa that is out in southwestern England. And there's kind of two levels of Chedworth because it's a lovely place right next to a natural spring. So the Tudors also used it as a hunting lodge. There's a Victorian hunting lodge built on top, but a lot of what was the Roman villa remains. So it had been a National Trust property, open to the public for many, many decades, but it turned out that there were a great number of mosaics that were not on display that had been discovered and then covered up, and like pathways had been cemented on top of them. So when a big preservation project was introduced, it was, hey, why don't we uncover those mosaics under the walkways and see what we can do to put those on display. So this is that initial uncovering. I am stabilizing the missing tesserae, which are the little rocks in a mosaic. And then we sort of stabilized them, padded them, and then they built a modern building over top of the entire villa in this area so that they could then put all of these mosaics on display year round. And hopefully they survived. I believe the construction project is finished or close to finished now. So we will see what my stabilization on these 2,000-year-old mosaics ended up doing or not doing for us when that construction project's complete. More Roman stuff. I don't just do Roman stuff, but Roman stuff is fascinating. This is one of the displays that was happening in London in preparation for the London Olympics. We kind of decided to rewind back to Roman Londinium with our Museum of London Cultural Olympics project where we put Roman material on display all over the city. So this is at Enfield, which is a small borough in London that has a visitor center, a convention center, and they put on a Roman exhibition. And we had these fabulous little face pots where there's sort of these like cartoony little noses and mouths and eyes on the sides of these pots. So yeah, this was couriering priceless Roman objects to hundreds and hundreds of venues all over England and mostly London to just kind of share a lot of the stuff that we have in storage at the Museum of London.
Now, I have to ask, were any of these objects, of course, as a historical context, right, the Romans actually got as far as England or the British Isles, right, in their conquest. Are any of these items from that area, or were these brought to London from other areas?
These are all from London. The Museum of London only houses material that was found in the city of London. So we've got 25,000 years worth of objects, but only from the few square miles of where you're standing. So it kind of makes this fabulous depth of culture for precisely this one place, which is why it's one of my favorite museums in the world.
Well, that's wonderful. Amanda Watts, thank you so much for giving us this context, this historical background, this information about the archaeological work that you've done. This is very fascinating.
Thank you. I think hopefully our new course that we're putting out at Minot State University, Humanities 325, will give students a chance to really dig deep into, yeah, you've read literature about the Romans, but like, what were they actually doing? What did they have? What did they own? How did they live their daily lives? And the ways that objects can kind of fill in some of those blanks that the text doesn't.
Well, we've reached that point of the program where we have to say goodbye, but thanks again for watching episode 31 of the Minot State University Lookout. The MSU Lookout is here for you, for your scholarship. If you'd like to talk with the community about it, if you'd like to show more of what you do, we'd be glad to bring your work out and expose it to the internet community. Thanks again for watching, and as we always say at this point of the program, this is Minot State University. Be seen, be heard, be inspired. Thanks again.